Billy Tylig. Minister, if you want to move into position. And Deputy O'Rourke, you're to move the motion.
Margaret Cahirlock, I move the motion. I welcome the opportunity to speak on it, and I'm sharing time in this slot with Deputies O'Brien, McLaughlin, Curran and Doherty. I have 6 minutes. I think this motion sets out a number of proposals that we believe are absolutely essential to address the cost of living crisis, specifically focused on the price of electricity in particular. Call for support for the motion across the House because what we need is an aggressive and comprehensive response to an unprecedented crisis and one which is having a huge impact on families and is, I would say, the most pressing concern for families around the country at this time. We set out in the motion our proposals to cut household electricity bills and cap them at 2021 prices, to introduce cash payments to assist low and middle income households with their other energy bills, to make a double child benefit payment for every child in recognition of the fact that larger households have greater energy demands and electricity demands, and importantly to introduce a windfall tax so that excess profits are used for the benefit of our population and people in need. And this is in this motion we have those number of proposals which will be part of a suite of social welfare and taxation measures that Sinn Féin will propose and announce in our alternative budget in advance of the government's own budget. And I want, in my contribution, to focus on a couple of aspects on the electricity cap and on the windfall tax. And I think they're intimately related as proposals, and one thing underpins both of them, and that is a clear recognition that the market is broken and must be reformed. This has been clear for over a year. Gas is being used as a weapon of war, and any of us who have engaged with those working in this sector indicate to us that it was apparent that as far back as this time last year and earlier that the tap was being turned by Russia. The electricity price cap is the right move at the right time. It provides certainty for families under huge pressure at this time. It provides reprieve for families at a time of great pressure and uncertainty. And whilst it's not a permanent solution, it buys time to introduce the sort of systematic reforms that are needed. And importantly, as a universal measure, and I think we do have to get the balance right in terms of universal versus targeted measures, and we need to lean towards the prioritisation of targeted measures, but as a universal measure, it has the advantage of maintaining the link with usage. I think that it is in effect an electricity unit price cap as opposed to an electricity bill price cap. The government's proposal of a credit, which we saw introduced very slowly earlier this year, and we've seen various kites flown in recent weeks. It could be, a €600 credit over 3 payments. It could be further beyond that. It will be denied to travellers in halting sites, as it was before. It will be denied to some living in multi-unit buildings where there's only 1 metre, and it will be given on the double to people with holiday homes. Energy credits will be a bonanza for those people. That proposal from government has the same weaknesses as it always had. It goes hand in hand with a windfall tax. Individual and important elements to address a broken market and the super excess crisis-related profits of energy companies. And there's two parts to any windfall tax: the huge profits being made by energy generators, and also which the European Union are referring to a solidarity tax, but also the huge windfall that is arising to renewables companies because of the pegging of gas prices to electricity prices. I have to say, the suggestion that Sinn Féin are at risk of writing a blank cheque to energy companies, I have to say, is the greatest bluff of them all, coming from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in particular, parties that sold off our gas assets. Vermilion reported 267% increase at Corrib profits between 21 and 2020. In the second quarter of this year, the parent company recorded €214 million of profits, up 28% year on year, sold off to the private interests. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael similarly sold off our gas utility companies, deregulated the market, and treated, as they did with so many things, energy as a commodity, not as a right, not as a utility. And indeed, this government fought for a year against reforms of the EU energy market. Why? To protect the profits of energy companies on the hope, nothing more, that they would invest those profits in new energy infrastructure, hopefully some of it which would be renewables. We missed the opportunity of the Iberian exemption, despite having a real opportunity to make the exact same case. So this government has a clear track record of not doing enough. Sinn Féin's proposals contained in this motion tonight points the right direction.
Chair, and I'd like to thank my colleagues Darren O'Rourke and Pearse Doherty and others for tabling this important motion today. Minister, like deputies across this House, pretty much every day now, I'm dealing with families who are experiencing a level of financial stress certainly I haven't seen in my time as a deputy in this House. I'm dealing, for example, with HAP tenants who are unable to keep up with the cost of living and their top-ups to the landlords, begging their local authorities to give them a discretionary uplift, which they're being refused, and imminently at risk of homelessness. I'm dealing with private renters who are just above the thresholds for social housing, who are working 2 jobs to keep the roof over their head, and despite the fact that the government hasn't increased the social housing thresholds since 2011, continues to refuse to do so. And again, those same families are either unable to make ends meet or are fearful of what will happen if they get a notice to quit, and again, rendering them homeless. I'm talking to mortgage holders who have now had 2 interest rate hikes, and if the second hike is passed on by their bank, that will wipe out everything we're hearing from government in terms of the meagre measures you're proposing to deal with the rising cost of energy. And I raise these 3 cases because they are real-life cases that I and many other deputies are dealing with day and daily. But what is common to all of these families is they simply cannot afford the cost of heating their home and of using utilities to keep their children fed and the clothes on their back clean. And the idea that giving those people on its own a cash payment, no matter what amount, simply doesn't deal with the key concern that they have, which is even with the cash payment, the prices themselves are too high and they are fearful of further price hikes. So the great merit of the Sinn Féin proposal that Mary Lou MacDonald outlined earlier today, that Deputy Rourke has just outlined to you, and Deputies Doherty and Mairead Farrell will outline in fine detail when we publish our alternative budget on Friday week, is that it deals not only with the immediate cost by dragging those costs back to summer 2021 levels. It not only puts money back in a targeted way in the pockets of lower-income families, it also ensures that they won't have any further price rises between now and February or March of next year. I don't see how anybody could think that that wasn't the most sensible way to approach this. I have to say the Taoiseach today was incredibly disingenuous when he used that phrase blank cheque, because he knows from all of the media that Pearse and Merlew and others did yesterday that the purpose of the windfall tax we're proposing is to be a tax on excessive profits if companies choose to try and use it as a blank cheque, something that they would not be able to do under our proposals. This is sensible, this is needed, and if you don't do something like this, those families out there under such enormous pressure will have the worst winter in decades. It doesn't have to be that way. You can make a real difference. I urge you to support this proposal.
Minister, when it comes to the energy crisis, workers and families are really being failed by this government. Government announced a cost of living package back in February when inflation was at about 5.5%, and for much of that time you added what was announced then with what was announced in the budget 4 months beforehand, and that was your cost of living budget. Throughout recent months, inflation has climbed to over 9%, and yet people are still waiting for help. And aside from the electricity credit, which by the time it was paid, nearly 5 months after it was announced, that was wiped out, the only other energy support announced was the fuel allowance. And as we know, the fuel allowance is an extremely limited scheme. The vast majority of households, particularly workers, are locked out of the fuel allowance. They do not receive it. They have never received it. In June, the additional needs payment was announced. It tweaked what was there in relation to the urgent needs payment. This was welcome, and I welcomed it at the time. However, this is particularly one way in which government are failing households. This payment was widely promoted by government ministers. I would like to think it was presumed obvious that demand for this payment would be high, given it was aimed particularly not just at those on social welfare, but also on workers. Yet the entire process in relation to that, which is an emergency social welfare payment, that entire process is up in a heap. Demand for that scheme in January, February was about 6,000 applications. In July, it's over 17,000. And figures I received earlier this month from the Department of Social Protection say that 95% of current applications are taking between 5 to 8 weeks to be finalised. Now, can you imagine having a bill you cannot pay in a household struggling, waiting up to 2 months for what is supposed to be an emergency payment? The Minister had said before recess that it was been looked at by the Department to put that payment online as an option for people. That is still apparently been looked at by the Department. We need to return these payments to the community welfare officers within our communities if we are going to make sure that that support is available to people when they need it. Applications like that need to be resourced properly so people get support when they need it. If they're waiting for 2 months, then it is no good. And clearly demand for that scheme is going to increase. The proposals in this motion are exactly what is needed. They reduce costs and they put money back in people's pockets. But as well as that, existing supports that are there need to be resourced, and emergency social welfare payments cannot take 2 months to be processed.
Minister, the response of the government to this energy crisis has been differing again. If you look at the league table of European countries in terms of what they provided to their people as a percentage of GDP, Ireland is right there at the bottom of the list. Only Denmark is worse. That's just a shameful response to an unprecedented energy crisis that our people face, be it home heating oil, be it solid fuels, be it petrol, diesel for their cars, wherever they turn for businesses, for workers, for families. This has had a crippling burden on them. But your strategy has been to wait until the winter and put something on the table then. And what Sinn Féin has put before you has to be implemented. Absolutely has to be implemented, where you would cut and cap electricity charges to levels before this crisis, and that you would have direct payments, targeted payments to those who most need it. You have the issues around child benefit, and of course you have the issue around the need to address the rent crisis due to your own shambles of a management of our housing system. So, to summarise, this government has been appalling in its response to this energy crisis. You're at the bottom of the European League table. You have centre-right politicians across Europe ahead of you in terms of the taxes that are required, the windfall taxes on the companies, and you have a situation across the border where Nicola Sturgeon has banned evictions and said that we need to have a freeze on rents. So all across Europe there are examples. You're behind the curve. You need to listen to Sinn Féin tonight and do what's right by our people, finally.
May I say to you on behalf of the government that it is time for your government to wake up to the reality of where ordinary workers are at. Families who are facing a cost of living crisis that they've never seen before. Many of them forced into decisions that they thought they would never have to make, whether to put food on the table or to keep the heat going. And we see families that used to once donate to the food banks are now themselves standing in those queues waiting for those same parcels. So the choice that the state has before it is simple. It is one which on one hand allows our citizens to fall into poverty, into financial hardship, or on the other hand to step up, to wake up to the reality, to step up to the plate and to fulfil its duty and to act. And that is what the motion before the House from Sinn Féin calls on you to do today, to act in the interest of our people in the middle of this cost of living crisis, because that is exactly what it's at. So our motion is very clear. It has a number of areas. Firstly, it deals with the issue of energy. And we know, compared to the summer of last year, compared to now, compared to the winter that we're facing into, households on average are paying €1,300 more on their electricity bills. Sinn Féin says that needs to stop. We need to cut those bills for those families, for those workers, for those households. We need to bring it back to the level it was pre this crisis, back to the €1,000 on average. And we need to do that during the period of this winter, giving not only families the reduction in their electricity bills, but giving them something that is so valuable in these pressing times, and that is certainty. Certainty that the bills will not increase, that on this issue the government has your back, that we are with you on this. And we're taking the pressure from you. It is a simple proposal. It is a proposal, Minister, that you're aware that your colleagues in other European jurisdictions have implemented. In Romania, they have extended the cap on energy prices up until the August of next year. In France, they've nationalised their system to allow for certainty in energy. In other countries, they have used different models. We should be doing the same. We need a government that understands the crisis that families are under. We need a government that's willing not to dither, but to act in the interest of people. So it can be done, just as others have done, to bring energy prices, electricity prices back to where they were pre-crisis, reducing them by up to €1,300 annually and keeping them at that level right up until the end of February. It is time limited. It's not a blank cheque, the sound bites that government throw out. Instead of actually grappling with the suggestions that we've had that will help people, you try and dismiss and brush away. But on top of that, we need an excessive profit tax, similar to what Italy has. You'll be familiar with that. They actually increased the rate recently to a higher rate to make sure that energy providers are not profiteering through this crisis or through the commitment that government would give to underwrite the difference in the price of electricity that would be charged to households and the cost that they have of delivering it. There are two proposals that can work, but we recognise that families and workers are facing many more pressures. Whether it's the pressure of the price of heating your home through home heating oil or gas, whether it's the costs that are increasing in terms of food, in terms of clothing, whether it's the costs that are increasing in terms of petrol and diesel, getting from A to B, essential costs in this day and age. And that is why we need to see government go further. We need cost of living cash payments targeted at those who are most in need. For individual incomes over the age of 18, earning below €21,000, we need to see €500 going into their pockets in the next month. We need to see step-down payments for people earning right up to €70,000 to help them get through these winter months. So politics is all about choices. You know that, I know that, and these are about choices. But for many people that are sitting at home, people who may be tuning in to this debate, they don't know, they can't see the choices. All they see is the rattle of the letterbox and another bill that has increased landing through it. They are feared of the postman or the postwoman walking down that lane. It is time for government to act. As Padraig McLaughlin pointed out, the Financial Times pointed out that this government is the second worst government in Europe in relation to its spend as a proportion of GDP in terms of supporting businesses and supporting households during this energy crisis. So, as I said, this government needs to wake up. It needs to wake up to really what is happening. You need to understand the depths of this crisis, where workers and families are at. We are putting on the table the solutions that are needed. These are the policies that I would implement if I were Minister for Finance. And let me say to you, these are the policies that you should be implementing, that the Green Party should be implementing if you're worth your salt in this government. Thank you.
Deputy Duncan.
Minister, households are facing the worst cost of living crisis in a generation. Ordinary workers and families, indeed small businesses, cannot take any more, and they certainly cannot face into a winter with bills that continue to skyrocket and could cripple them. Households need long-term solutions to this cost of living crisis, not one-off measures which will do nothing to fix the root cause of the problems households are facing. It is predicted households can expect to pay a total of $1,200 for gas and electricity for just 2 months in winter. That is scandalous and beyond what many families can manage. How do the government expect households to cope with this? Or agus Arish, Fecamid Gwil and Realtas Roval or Lewis Shellida or people are strapped to the pin of their collar. The scale of the response must match the scale of the crisis. The government currently lack the vision and ambition to deliver long-term solutions to this crisis, instead preferring short-term measures as useful as trying to fix a broken leg with a plaster. Analysis with the Financial Times found that Ireland has the second weakest response of 24 countries, excepting Denmark. While the government expects households to shoulder excessive prices and companies are allowed to enjoy windfall profits. Tána réiteach Sinn Féin, Tá fís agus an dúlagang an ggéir céim seo a réiteach. Tá minic mola laidú or costasí electricus agus cníd commodities. We need to cap, we need to cut and cap. Sinn Féin are proposing reducing electricity prices for households and keeping them at 2021 prices from October to the end of February at €1,000 inclusive of VAT and standing charges. Sinn Féin are also proposing that income-linked cost of living cash payments starting at €500 for low-income families, for low-income individuals, taper gradually to €100 on up to incomes of 70,000, as well as a doubling of child benefit as families use a significant amount of credit of energy. Sinn Féin have the solutions that will give certainty to households in Cork and throughout the country that they will be able to weather this winter without significant financial hardship. It is high time for the government to take this on board and offer the relief, certainty and protection to families, to workers and to businesses that they need this winter.
Energy price hikes are crippling people throughout the state. Households are facing into the worst cost of living crisis in living memory, and they're getting hammered left, right and centre by ever-rising prices. And a clear sign of the government not getting the pressure people are under was when Minister Ryan recently suggested ways for people to reduce their energy bills, as if they hadn't been doing that already. Now, government dismissed opposition's calls for an emergency budget during the summer recess. They ignored the crisis coming down the road, and they've made little progress developing sustainable energy alternatives to move us away from fossil fuels. Now, this motion here tonight offers solutions to stop people from having to make hard decisions this winter. Sinn Féin are calling on the government to reduce energy costs by capping prices based on 2021 figures. We want you to introduce targeted measures to assist low and middle income workers and families with these bills in a meaningful way. We want you to pay a double child benefit payment which recognises the stress that's being put on young families. We need you to bring in a windfall tax on these companies that are gouging people across this state. Now, you can't ditter and delay any longer. It's time for the government to wake up and realise how stretched people are. You need to act in their interests instead of letting costs spiral and people being ripped off by companies seizing an opportunity to make enormous profits. The time for sitting on your hands has long passed. The time for action is now.
Minister, as we approach the winter, we're facing into the worst living crisis that we can ever remember for generations. But Europeans are facing into a winter of record energy prices. But in Ireland, people are contending with these energy increases on top of what was already an unmanageable cost of living. You have extortionate rents, you have childcare costs that are equivalent to a second mortgage, you have mortgages increases, and that's just to mention a few. And energy is only the latest crisis that people in Ireland have to contend with. People were already at the brink, Minister, but this winter they're going to be pushed over the edge. Your government's response to this crisis has been disgraceful and slow. You have failed to accelerate the development of our own renewable energy resources, which is key to ensuring energy affordability, sustainability and security. Yourself, Minister Ryan, opposed reform of the wholesale electricity market in October 21, which would have helped reduce energy costs. And the building of new data centres, which is encouraged all the way, despite repeated warnings about their effect on our energy sustainability and security. And on top of all this, you continue to increase carbon taxes. It's been said repeatedly over recent months, people will not be able to heat their homes this winter. People will have to choose between heating their home and feeding their family. It's a crisis situation. And Minister Ryan, you seem to value the protection of the market above everything else, including your own people. And your dithering and inaction is going to have serious consequences for ordinary people. Over the summer, Bord Gáis announced that operating profits rose by 74% in the first part of this year. That's frankly disgusting, given the current situation. Our PMB has outlined the measures that we would introduce, and if we follow the government plan and offer only energy credits without capping prices, Minister, those credits could be next to worthless if energy companies keep hiking up their prices. It's 2 weeks to the budget, and I'm asking you, like other colleagues have said, to wake up and deal with this crisis in a meaningful way, implement our proposals for the sake of workers and families across the state.
This motion aims to assist people with their household bills. We need to reduce the costs and put money back in people's pockets. Now, the last straw was the latest rounds of announcement of electricity prices going from 27% to 34%. For many, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, in addition to mortgages and back-to-school costs. I spoke last week with a large employer, an employer of 130 employees in County Kerry. He showed me his electricity bills, and the difference that he has between January of 2019 and January of 2020 was an increase of 35%. In February, 36%. March, it was down to 31%, but in April and May, it was back up to 78% increase and a 70% increase. In all of his years, the manager told me, in his 25 years in the business, this is the most uncertain time that he has ever faced going forward. He has no control over costs, and even though every cost-saving measure has been gone throughout his building, in hospitality. He wants to deliver a service that reflects good things about County Kerry. He needs all the help and support. We've heard an awful lot about people in their own homes and the increased cost of €1,000 with their electricity bills. The refusal of this government to bring forward an emergency budget before the summer recess left people on their own. Your refusal, Minister, acting on behalf of the government to reform the electricity market, which has already been mentioned, would have reduced the bills of households and businesses sooner. So what we need to do is we need to cut household electricity bills. We need to cap them at 2021 prices. We need to introduce the cash payments, a double child benefit payment and a windfall tax. That manager also gave me a list of all the different increases that he has from the food prices, his rates bill, and we heard about gougers earlier on, and it came back to the biggest gougers in the country, the insurance industry. His bill in 2020 and 2021 in the middle of COVID was 65 and 67,000. But who comes rearing their ugly heads again? The insurance industry. 160,000 is the insurance bill for the year, which is the real threat to putting them out of business on top of everything else. So we have tried to introduce measures. The old reliables, the old usual suspects are getting away with it, but they've been joined now. We must act soon. We must act in the budget to reduce the cost for everyone.
For those in my constituency of Dublin North West who are dependent on domestic fuel oil, it has come as a huge shock to see that only last year fuel costs in Dublin averaged at around 68 cents per litre for domestic fuel. It has since rose to a staggering 132 cents per litre, having reached a peak in May of almost 176 cents per litre. To fill a tank would cost an average around €1,300. How long this fill would last would of course depend on usage. A poorly insulated house would use more fuel. Larger families would use more fuel as well. So a full tank might only last a couple of months before a second fill is needed in order to get through the remainder of the winter. This is beyond the means of many pensioners and low-income families. So many are being forced to choose between putting aside what little money they have to heat their homes or to put food on the table. Everything is rising in cost, and electricity and gas suppliers and fuel companies have put up their prices on a number of occasions over the last year. I see a real situation developing where vulnerable old people would try to save money on energy costs, but not always heating their home, and then putting themselves at risk of hypothermia. We can't put the elderly or families at risk by fuel poverty. Energy companies are making exceptional profits during these times of crisis. Bord Gáis, for example, has seen its profits surge to 74% for the first half of this year alone. It is only reasonable that some of these excessive profits should be taxed and used to alleviate the dire circumstances many in my constituency are facing at the moment. Other measures to alleviate the hardships people are experiencing now that the government could implement would be to give a double child benefit payment to every child, cap electricity prices and assist low and middle income families by a direct cost of living cash payments to support workers and families. Families are suffering now, and as winter approaches, it's going to get worse. Now is the time to implement remedial measures to alleviate some of the pain resulting from this cost of living crisis. Thank you.
Inflation measure. Sinn Féin is putting forward a proposal to protect households from any further price gouging by the big electricity suppliers. We're calling for electricity prices to be reduced and capped at 2021 prices throughout the winter period to at least February 2023. Irish households have experienced soaring price hikes in energy costs, as well as crippling other price increases in food and a whole range of areas, transport and everything else. And they badly need support. There have been almost 50 energy price increases over the past year, Minister. The Financial Times places Ireland 26th out of 27 countries in the EU in relation to state support for households during the energy crisis. There's the facts as set out by the Financial Times. This government can no longer sit in its hands while workers and families struggle and people freeze with the cold this winter. The so-called market, as it's called, is broken. Sinn Féin is calling for a proactive response to this crisis. We would establish a fund of 1.6 billion, and this is affordable, Minister, ring-fenced this year from the budget surplus of 4.5 billion, and that's without going near the contingency fund that's there of 2.5 billion. And this will be supported by revenue from a windfall tax on energy companies. The windfall tax will be introduced on any excess profits made by electricity suppliers, as has been done in a list of other European countries. This is an anti-inflationary measure, and it will reduce prices at source, and it will help right across the economy. The 1.6 billion fund will provide households with energy security and certainty throughout the winter. It will also save households in the region of €600 on their bills, and it will stop the price gouging by the big suppliers. Our approach is in stark contrast to the government's, which is inflationary. We are not writing a blank cheque for energy companies to extract profits. Any excess profits would be taxed to stop this. That's the difference. Instead, we want to fix energy prices so that ordinary people can be protected and households have certainty. Sinn Féin is also proposing cost of living cash payments. Those earning €21,000 a year would receive €500 in a cash payment, while those earning €40,000 would receive €407, and that would be tapered off up to €70,000, and beyond that wouldn't receive anything. The emergency measures, these will help households throughout the winter and are badly needed. And just in relation to energy security, Minister, I raised in this chamber a number of years ago here the need for Shannon Bridge to be kept open and not Knockgree. The power station in Derry is being co-fired and is now moving completely to biomass. The same thing could be done in those two power stations. I pointed out that these are in pivotal positions on the energy grid. The cutaway bogs surrounding these have ample space for solar panels. They're plug-in points to the electricity grid. We need dispatchable power. Also, wind power could be plugged in there. And the wind doesn't blow the whole time. There could also be a hub for biomass, for biomass to be connected in. These should have been power generation hubs. We weren't listened to. I published a document back 5 years ago, Power in Ireland 2030, that would move us to 80% renewable. We got no hearing on it. The media weren't interested, and people in government benches were not interested. Nobody was interested. I raised some of these issues with your minister, with your leader, on the Climate Committee at the time, and he told me that if we were stuck for power, we could import nuclear power from Britain. I said to him at that time what we need dispatchable power here in this country, and we could have had that. We could have had the dispatchable power that we need, but we weren't listened to at the time. And that dispatchable power can only be got, one of the best ways of getting it is through biomass. We were in a position to do that. Those two power stations should have been moved to be converted. It wasn't done. It now should be done. Those two power stations need to be reopened for that purpose, and also to become those plug-in points on those pivotal positions on the energy grid here, on the national energy grid, so as we can generate power there, from solar, from wind, but the wind doesn't blow the whole time and the sun doesn't blow the whole time, but also the biomass. Gas as well has to be recognised as a transition fuel. We have to recognise this reality. There are coal mines in China as big as County Dublin and as big as County Laois put together. I'm not arguing for that here. I know we have to move away from fossil fuel, but we also have to recognise the reality that gas has a lower carbon content and lower carbon emissions than coal. We'll agree on that much, much times lower. And that should have been done at the time. Instead of that, we have been sleepwalked by Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and now the Greens into this crisis of energy security. What's your proposal? Your proposal is to import generators. And I heard a Taoiseach on the radio yesterday morning, and I'll tell you, he didn't inspire confidence in me, because if I heard him correctly on the radio, what he actually said was that it'll be 2023 before these emergency generators are in place. I understand that a figure of 40 million was mentioned. What are these to be fuelled with? Diesel? Is that the case? What are we going to fuel these emergency generators with? Instead of that, We had a sustainable way of doing it here, of reducing carbon emissions. Fair enough, we move away from peat, we use biomass, and we use biogas, and we use anaerobic digestion and all the other means that we can use to generate electricity. And we didn't do that. The government also have, and every government over the last 12 years, has dragged their heels in relation to the regulations for planning for offshore wind. We have seven turbines after 20 years. That's what we have off our coast. It's a scandal. We should be exporting energy. We should be a net exporter of energy to the rest of Europe. We're not doing that. Instead of that, we have sleepwalked into this crisis. We're paying hostage now to the big energy companies who have us over a barrel. We need now to take some control of that. The measure being put forward by Sinn Féin here tonight goes some way to doing that, along with the measures, hopefully, that will come out at European level over the next week or so to tackle the big generators, and that serves that purpose. This measure, the measure we are proposing specifically, will help to deal with the suppliers and the smaller generators. But I'm also asking you, as a matter of urgency, to forget about all the cul-de-sacs you have allowed us to walk into, and to look again at Shannon Bridge, and to look again at Loughree, and let's face common sense and work with good companies like Bord that we do own, and ESB, to get this power going. EU rules can be waved to one side as well, Minister, and you know this and I know it, in an emergency situation. In an emergency situation, all rules, all bets are off. You know that and I know that. Let's move to a greener future that produces jobs, that produces energy security, but lowers prices. Let's implement these measures as put forward by Sinn Féin tonight, along with the once-off financial package for households. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response. So that concludes our consideration of the motion, and we must first decide then on the amendment to the motion, which has been made by Solidarity People Before Profit. You pressing that amendment, Deputy Boyd Barrett? Is the amendment agreed? Not agreed. Na teachta tar hefna tarishkana abradish ta. In the goodna, abradish neil. Stolim quil butcher and cash to believe the question is defeated. Insofar as the vote has been called, it's deferred until the voting block